In March of 1974, a Japanese soldier walked out of a Philippine jungle in a patched uniform, carrying a rifle he had oiled every single day for nearly 3 decades. He was still fighting World War II. It had officially been over for 29 years. Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who fought World War II for 29 extra years. The full story. Chapter 1. The Making of a Soldier. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, one of 7 children in a household that valued discipline above almost everything else. At 18 he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army, an unremarkable recruit lost among thousands of others heading toward the same war. But an instructor noticed something in him during training: patience, a talent for reading unfamiliar terrain, and an unusual willingness to follow an order through to its absolute conclusion, no matter how long that took. That combination was rare enough to get him pulled out of the regular infantry and routed toward a very different kind of soldiering altogether. He was sent to the Futamata branch of the Nakano Military School, Japan's secretive academy for intelligence officers and guerrilla specialists. There he studied things no ordinary infantryman ever learned: sabotage, propaganda, unconventional combat, and how to survive off hostile land indefinitely, without resupply, without backup, and without any fixed end date. His instructors drilled a single principle into every cadet above all others. A Nakano officer does not surrender and does not take his own life, because a living soldier, however isolated, can still be useful to the empire. It was less a rule of engagement than a way of thinking, and it would come to define the rest of Onoda's life. Chapter 2. Orders for Lubang. In December 1944, now a second lieutenant, Onoda was deployed to Lubang, a small island in the Philippines roughly 90 miles southwest of Manila. His mission was to wage guerrilla warfare against the American invasion everyone in the Japanese command knew was coming, destroying the island's airstrip and pier if the moment allowed, and disrupting enemy operations by any means available. His superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him instructions that were almost impossibly rigid, even by Nakano standards. Under no circumstances was Onoda to surrender. Under no circumstances was he to die by his own hand. Whatever happened, Taniguchi told him, it may take 3 years or it may take 5, but someone would eventually come back for him. The invasion arrived fast and hit hard. American and Filipino forces overran Lubang within months, and the small garrison Onoda was supposed to help command collapsed almost immediately around him, with most of the island's defenders killed or captured in the fighting. Onoda, along with a handful of stragglers who had scattered rather than been overrun, retreated deep into the island's mountainous jungle interior. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was: a defeated, broken unit disappearing into the trees. From Onoda's perspective, trained precisely for this scenario, it was simply the mission beginning as designed: vanish into the terrain and keep fighting until someone with the authority to stop you says otherwise. Chapter 3. A War That Refused to End. In August 1945, Japan surrendered and the Second World War officially ended. Word reached Lubang almost immediately, dropped from aircraft as leaflets and broadcast over loudspeakers positioned around the island. Onoda and the 3 men still with him, Privates Yuichi Akatsu and Kenshichi Kozuka, and Corporal Shoichi Shimada, read the notices and dismissed every one of them without hesitation. To soldiers trained to expect elaborate enemy trickery at every turn, a leaflet calmly announcing total Japanese defeat looked exactly like what their instructors had warned them it would look like: propaganda engineered to lure hidden intelligence officers out into the open so they could be captured or killed. Search parties came looking for them anyway, again and again, across the following years. Family members recorded personal messages that were played over loudspeakers carried through the jungle. Genuine, verifiable newspapers were deliberately left along trails for the holdouts to find. None of it worked. Every rescue attempt, Onoda later explained, simply confirmed what his training had already told him to expect: a determined enemy would go to extraordinary lengths to trick a Nakano-trained officer into breaking cover. The harder the outside world tried to convince him the war was over, the more thoroughly it convinced him he was up against a very patient, very sophisticated deception. Chapter 4. The Shrinking Squad. Life on Lubang settled into a grim, disciplined routine. The four men built hidden camps that they abandoned and rebuilt constantly to avoid detection, and they survived on coconuts, bananas, and the occasional stolen cow, supplementing it all with rice taken from village storehouses. What they could not carry away, they burned, so no one else could benefit from it either. Villagers came to genuinely fear the raids. Over the decades that followed, occasional shootouts broke out with local police and farmers who stumbled across the group by accident, and a number of Lubang Islanders were killed or wounded in these encounters, casualties of a war that, for every other participant on Earth, had ended decades earlier. Exactly how many islanders died is one of the few points where accounts genuinely diverge. Some estimates put the toll around 30 killed over the nearly 3 decades of raids, while other tallies are considerably lower, and precise records from a remote island across that many years were never fully reconciled. What is not disputed is that real people, farmers and villagers going about ordinary lives, were killed and wounded in a conflict that existed nowhere else on the planet. It is the darkest thread in a story that is often told, understandably, as pure survival adventure. The group itself began to shrink almost as steadily as the war around them faded from memory. In September 1949, Private Akatsu quietly slipped away from the others on his own initiative. After roughly 6 months surviving alone in the jungle, he surrendered to Philippine authorities in 1950, telling them his 3 former comrades were still out there, still armed, and still entirely convinced the war continued. In May 1954, Corporal Shimada was killed in a shootout after a Philippine Army patrol training on the island stumbled directly into his position. That left only 2 men standing watch over a war the rest of the world had stopped fighting, Onoda, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. For 18 more years, Onoda and Kozuka lived like ghosts, methodically setting fire to harvested rice stores as a coded signal. They believed that Japanese resistance still burned somewhere on Lubang. It was a message aimed at a headquarters that had stopped listening for it in 1945. Then, in October 1972, Kozuka was shot and killed by local police during one of these very raids. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Hiroo Onoda was completely, absolutely alone on the island, the last man left fighting a war that had ended before some of the police now hunting him had even been born. Chapter 5. 30 Years Alone. Kozuka's death made international headlines, because it proved, undeniably and for the first time in years, that at least one armed Japanese soldier was still alive and active on Lubang. It triggered an entirely fresh wave of search parties, this time backed by real government resources and international press attention. Teams combed the jungle with loudspeakers, printed photographs, and translators. Onoda watched most of them from hiding and evaded every single one. By this point he had spent 28 years perfecting the specific art of not being found on this one island, and a search party working against a budget and a deadline was simply no match for a man who had nowhere else to be and, by any ordinary measure, all the time in the world. Back in Japan, Onoda had become something close to a legend, a name attached to newspaper headlines that almost no living person had actually confirmed with their own eyes. Rumors and half-facts swirled freely. Some assumed he was already dead, others imagined a whole hidden company of holdouts rather than one exhausted, aging lieutenant. The reality was far smaller and, in its own way, far stranger. It was a single man in his early 50s, alone in volcanic mountains, meticulously maintaining a rifle for a war that no longer existed anywhere on Earth except inside the specific orders he had memorized nearly 30 years earlier and never once been told to abandon. Chapter 6. The Backpacker Who Broke the Spell. In February 1974, a 20-year-old Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang. Suzuki was traveling the world on a self-declared quest to find, in his own words, Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, roughly in that order of difficulty. Unlike the official search parties with their schedules and loudspeaker trucks, Suzuki simply wandered into the jungle alone, calling out Onoda's name and Kozuka's, and made a deliberate point of camping in the open rather than trying to hunt his target down through the undergrowth. After 4 days of this, it worked. Onoda cautiously approached his campsite one evening and stood before him, rifle still in hand, ready for whatever trap this might turn out to be. The two men talked for hours by the fire. Suzuki explained, as countless others had tried and failed to explain before him, that the war had been over for almost 30 years. This time, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, something landed differently. Onoda still refused to formally surrender to a college backpacker with no military authority, but he told Suzuki precisely what it would take instead. His direct superior officer, Major Taniguchi, would have to travel to Lubang in person and formally relieve him of the exact orders he had been given in 1944. It was not stubbornness for its own sake, it was the one narrow condition his training had always allowed for. Suzuki flew home with photographic proof, and Japan finally had a concrete name to chase down. Chapter 7. The Order at Last. The Japanese government located Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who had given Onoda his original orders 3 decades before. He was no longer a military commander of any kind, he had spent the intervening years as an ordinary bookseller, decades removed from the war, genuinely astonished to learn that the offhand promise he had made in a jungle in 1944 had just, improbably, come due. Taniguchi agreed to fly to Lubang and personally finish what he had started so long ago. On March 9, 1974, escorted through the jungle by guides who knew the terrain, he walked in and stood face to face with the soldier who had spent 29 years waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. Taniguchi read the order aloud, exactly as protocol required. In accordance with the imperial command, the 14th Area Army had ceased all combat activity, and Onoda was relieved of duty, effective immediately. For Onoda, it was the one sentence, from the one voice, that could actually end a war no leaflet, no newspaper, and no loudspeaker broadcast ever had. The next day, March 10, 1974, Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle in a worn but carefully maintained uniform, laid down the rifle he had kept in functioning condition for 29 years, and formally surrendered to Philippine forces at Lubang's radar station. He was 51 years old. He had followed a single order for longer than most people hold a single career. Chapter 8. Homecoming and Legacy. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos formally pardoned Onoda for the killings carried out during his decades in hiding, and he flew home to a Japan that welcomed him back as something close to a national hero, a living relic of wartime devotion in an era eager for exactly that kind of story. But the country he returned to bore almost no resemblance to the one he had left behind in 1944. Tokyo had become a city of neon signs, traffic, and skyscrapers. The rigid, self-sacrificing culture he had trained under had given way to post-war consumer prosperity, and Onoda found himself genuinely disoriented and disillusioned by a homeland that had moved on without him in almost every way that mattered to him. In 1975, Onoda left Japan again, this time entirely by choice, joining a Japanese farming community in Brazil, where he ran a cattle ranch and married a Japanese tea ceremony teacher named Machi. Years later, unsettled by a violent crime committed by a Japanese teenager back home, he began returning to Japan periodically to found a series of survival camps for young people, determined to pass on the discipline and self-reliance the jungle had taught him, this time with the war finally, deliberately, left out of the lesson. Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo in January 2014, at the age of 91. He was not, strictly speaking, the very last Japanese holdout of the Second World War. A soldier named Teruo Nakamura surrendered on an Indonesian island later that same year, in December 1974. But no other holdout story was documented as thoroughly, or ended as dramatically, as Onoda's did, walking out of a jungle 3 decades late, in a uniform he had never once stopped maintaining, for a mission he had never once been told, by anyone he trusted, to abandon. Hiroo Onoda was not insane, and he was not simply lost. He was a soldier who did exactly what he had been trained to do, for 29 years, in a war that every other participant had long since walked away from. His story remains one of history's strangest tests of what happens when loyalty outlives the cause it was built to serve. History always has one more secret. Follow the oddities of history, and witness the past up close.